the News Channel 5 network, this is MorningLine with Nick Barris.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on MorningLine. Nick Barris with you on a Tuesday. We have a good show. We're going to talk about an issue I think that relates to all of us with regard to setting public policy and who it is we elect and how that's done and access for folks to vote. Now, it's timely, especially with the fact that we have the election here in Metro this Thursday, where we'll be electing a new mayor or possibly re-electing the incumbent. But with voting as it comes about, especially with the presidential election just around the corner, which is obviously when everyone turns out. I mean, we talk about low voter turnout. Whenever there's a presidential election, you get much higher levels. But still, there are those who don't vote. And the question of why they don't and whether or not there are barriers out there that make it difficult for certain segments of the population to get out, that's part of what we're going to talk about this morning with Tequila Johnson. She's from the Equity Alliance. Good morning to you, Tequila.
Good morning, Nick.
Nice to have you on.
Yes.
Well, I'll tell you what. By the way, why don't you let folks know what the Equity Alliance is first, and then we'll take it from there into voting.
Sure. So the Equity Alliance is a nonprofit organization. We are based here in Nashville, but we are a statewide organization. We believe in using our voting power in the fight for social justice and economic equality. We founded the Equity Alliance in order to just make sure that people were aware of the barriers to voting, but that people knew the importance of using their voting power. Mm-hmm. So we are all things civic, from civic education all the way up to civic leadership. We believe that democracy works best when everyone participates and everyone uses their voice.
Does it disappoint you when you sometimes see the amount of voter turnout?
Yes.
It's so low.
It's so low. I don't know if disappointment is the feeling. Sometimes it's disappointing, but at other times it is almost empowering, because the things that I know to be true are evident when I look at voter turnout, which is one, the biggest, voter suppression, voter apathy. And so it kind of sometimes gives me more fuel to keep going and to keep pushing and to keep.
Because you know it's needed.
I know that it's needed. Exactly.
Right. Let's talk, if we can, just right off the top, about what you perceive to be some of the barriers. And I know it can come, there's some new things that come along that people have been talking about changes to laws and how that goes. A lot of folks saying, well, what does she mean, voter barriers? I mean, come election day, if you live in Metro and you want to vote and you have the proper identification and all that, you can go vote. And can't everyone do that? Talk and explain what you perceive to be the barriers for voters.
Well, you said one in your statement, which was the proper identification. A few years back, there was an elderly woman who was in her 70s, I believe, who wanted to go and vote, but she did not have an ID. Okay. And she couldn't get an ID because she didn't have a birth certificate, and she was so old that she could not go out and get a birth certificate printed at the time. So a lot of times we think about some of these things and we think about them through our own lens and our own perception, and we don't see those play out in our lives, so we don't think they exist. But one of the things that makes the country, or our country and our city, what it is diversity. And within diversity, there are people who don't have the same access, don't have the same privileges as all of us, and those people are the ones who are hurt mostly by a lot of the voting barriers that are in place, IDs being one of them.
You're right. Okay, I've heard that. So, and within certain segments of the population, let's say within the African American population here in Metro, do you feel some of them feel that, what's the point to vote, and maybe that's why sometimes voter turnout's down?
Yes, I think that there was a point in time where African American voter turnout was up, and if you look at the numbers just on a national level, you'll see that African Americans tend to be a very loyal voting bloc. But what happens is we don't oftentimes see those changes reflected in our daily lives. A lot of people still live in extreme poverty. There are still high levels of incarceration and certain things that predominantly affect African American communities at a very alarming scale. And that is why the Equity Alliance, we focus on voting, but we focus on voting as an entry point into civic engagement. Voting is just the first step. It doesn't stop there. There's also accountability. There's also voter education so that you know what to expect from a particular office or candidate. I can't tell you how many times I've been in a room with people running for office, and they've asked for things that person doesn't have the autonomy to provide because they don't know how that plays into everyday life. And so that is one of the main things that we focus on is voter education, which is why every year we produce our voter guide that literally gives you a profile of every candidate, and it tells you what that office does.
Okay, right, which I think is a great idea. So you're educated as to what that person who's running for that can do for you if you elect them.
Exactly.
And then you're learning more about the candidates. So when you do this, I mean, do you see that getting through to some degree? What's the key to getting the vote out? What's the key?
I think that there are so many things that play into getting the vote out. One of the major things is candidates. When you look at the election of President Barack Obama, you saw huge numbers of turnout, and I don't think that was because of organizing alone. I think that Obama provided a sense of hope. He was something fresh. He was something new that a lot of people hadn't experienced in their lifetime. It was, he changed history. So people were excited to go out and vote for President Obama. But when you look at certain elections where it kind of looks like business as usual, people aren't as excited. People were excited to go out and vote for Stacey Abrams. People, are excited to go out and vote for certain candidates. But when you do have exciting candidates who aren't well-resourced, let's say, to be able to get people to the polls or to be able to get that name recognition and brand recognition out there, that one limits people. But again, people just don't see how this plays into their everyday life. And I think that there are a few people who are within this structure that want to keep it that way.
Yeah, because that controls the power.
That controls the power.
And that can get into redistricting, some of these barriers you're talking about. If you keep certain people from being able to vote easily or make their barriers, you keep the constituency on your side. All right, I wanted to ask you about this. I know you went and talked about this, testified before, I guess, a House subcommittee here in the state on the Voting Rights Act of 1965, all right? You're saying the teeth was taken out of that.
Yes.
Explain what that did, the Voting Rights Act, and that's 1965. That was a ways back.
Yeah, that was a ways back. So essentially what the Voting Rights Act did was give African Americans and other communities of color the right to vote. So it gave every citizen of the U.S. the right to vote. And within that, there were certain preemptions that required certain states, predominantly ones like Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, that had a history of doing discriminatory or employing discriminatory laws and practices. It put something in place that prevented them from just going in and making changes to rules around voting without having to go through this federal clearance first.
Okay, running it by. And so what the argument would be, without having this law in place, they could do things that would create more barriers, keeping certain ethnicities from getting to the polls.
And we've seen that happen. In 2013, in Shelby County, Texas, a judge ordered that preemption was no longer needed. And since then, we've seen where there have been so many laws, particularly in the state of Tennessee, the voter ID law, this law that just popped up around voter registration. There have been so many laws that have been passed over the last few years limiting or putting more barriers in place for people to go out and vote.
Yeah, and that touches on all kinds of things. Yeah, the voter ID laws, voting roll purges. We need to talk about the purges in place. Laws that make it more difficult for ex-felons to vote. All right, we'll take a break on that note. We've got some phone calls. Your thoughts on these barriers and how it plays out, what you think about this, and we'll hear more from Tequila Johnson with Equity Alliance right after this. Stay with us.